All right. Well, it was interesting that as folks were going around the horn there, introducing themselves. In particular, hearing from the folks who pointed out that they themselves weren't born Basque, but came to it from one path or another. And for those folks, well, first and foremost, like Elvis always said, thank you very much. It's one of the key ingredients why Basque culture continues to thrive. It's because folks who aren't Basque themselves show an interest in Basque things. And then that then in turn animates folks who, to a greater or lesser extent, connect with their Basque heritage. On a basic human level, it's always marvelous when someone else acknowledges something that you hold to be of importance. So, for example, we had some comments about the Boise Basque community. What allows something as distinctive, if not unique, as the Basque Block in Boise, though there are quite a few Basques in Boise, but there aren't enough Basques to sustain those businesses. See, so the Bada Guernica on one end, and the number of folks who go and visit the Basque Museum, just to use those as a couple of examples, they couldn't really stay in business if it wasn't for non-Basques. Because there just aren't enough Basques to sustain it, to make it viable. So a big part of actually Basque identity in the diaspora generally, and here in the American West, is the interest of non-Basques. So that's one of the key elements that I think ties into the whole theme for this presentation, God Basque. It's one thing if you were born Basque, you have some sort of, what is it, 132nd, 116th, 1/8, whatever that element might be. But to have someone else show that interest, and for me, one of these moments that serves kind of as an inspiration from a non-Basque, we had just finished doing a seminar at Boise State University. We had a Basque Studies program, this some years ago. And he was a graduate student, though he had taken a couple of Basque workshops. So he found out we were having this event. So he came. It was a 2-day event. He came to all of this. And he was the reason I point out graduate, he was older. So when we're all done, the organizers, we went, in fact, it was Bar Dene. We were on the Basque block. So we're just kind of recapping the event, how it went, and enjoying ourselves. So he comments, he goes, you Basques are cool cats. You do it all. I mean, so you have these big parties, you'll close down the street, there's these picnics, these festivals, and then you pivot and then you put on this academic symposium. And it's moments like that really resonate in particular for our young folks. When we're younger, and for some of this might be painful to have to recall this. When we were younger, most all of us, we were in search of the cool. All right. See, because when you're young, you don't want to stand out. You don't want to be that outlier. So you want to be in the in group, whatever that in group might be, and how it's perceived. All right. So you've got the 12, the 13-year-old person who's born Basque. They know they're Basque because they've gone to some festivals and the family has talked about it. But in having a conversation now with their friends, one of their friends said, now, are you Basque? And, the 12-year-old kind of, yeah. See, because you don't make a big deal about it, because then you have to start explaining what it is, since a lot of folks don't know. And he goes, well, yeah. And then the friend says, cool. I went to that Basque picnic wherever, and that was just marvelous. Just the day, all those events, right there, that's gold. See, that's gold for that 12-year-old to now perk up and say, I think I want to get a bit more of this Basque. And that's why in the diaspora generally, and here in the United States, a big part to explain why there's still a Basque presence is the willingness of our Basque neighbors to have embraced us, to have encouraged us to go forward. And it's not a hollow, this is not just a shout out to the folks who are saying I'm not Basque. I think it was one of the biggest Basque celebrations we have really in the world is Hayaldi. It's the largest Basque celebration outside of the Basque country. And in speaking with the organizer some years ago, at that time, Dave and Jeannie Igurin were the organizers. And then talking to them, they were planning, following Hayali, to have a thank you dinner. Because it's all done by volunteers. No one, Dave, Jeannie, nobody got a salary. Everything was volunteer in putting this on. They had 800 people over the course of those several days for this Hayaldi, 800 volunteers. And they tracked it to discover more than half of the volunteers were not Basque. So without those folks, we can't put on a lot of these things. Okay. So first and foremost, that's one of our greatest resources, is the willingness of folks who are maybe not Basque themselves to want to learn more about it. I know in my case, it serves as a great battery charge, to use that metaphor. All right, so once again, thanks again for those of you who aren't maybe Basque by identity, but you're Basque now. That's a new phenomena. I'd say at least 2 generations ago plus, you had to be born Basque. That was pretty much it to be considered Basque. That actually, for a lot of folks, isn't the case anymore. We take converts because we know these converts move tables and chairs and sell chorizos. So bring them on. We love them. Okay? So with that, I wanted to also now point out we've got some folks on this Zoom session who actually had an opportunity to go to the Basque Country. Their parents came from there. I will say a few things about what I refer to as Euro-Basques, or our Basque cousins from the Basque Country. But most of my comments will be focused primarily on not just the diaspora, but even more specifically to the Basque American experience. So that's what I was trying to signal there with this picture of the American and Basque flags. So with that, I figure I'm going to practice what I'm going to preach on this one. I'm going to do the very Basque thing. When we meet one another as Basques, one of the short list is you got to quickly go through your genealogy, where you come from. So case in point, it's very much an American thing that early on when you meet someone, you ask them, what do you do? That's very uncommon in the Basque Country. See, when you meet a Basque in the Basque Country, you're always talking about where your ancestors came from, and you're making these connections. See, because here in the United States, we ask that question a lot because a big part of who we might be is what we've chosen to do, the occupation we've chosen. See, but that's very recent, all right? And Basques being an old people, what you did and didn't say very much about who you are, right? But here in the United States, we take it kind of as a tell. Okay, whatever the occupation, the career that you have, in some, not all, but in some cases kind of can reveal your area of interest, where you've decided to go forward. But until recently, Basques never really went there. One of the first things they would be asking is, where are you from? Where's your family from? So following that model, I'm a Basque born here in Boise, Idaho. Now, in my particular case, my ancestors came from the province of Vizcaya. There are 7 historical provinces or regions that make up the Basque Country. The Basque Country itself is a very small place geographically, especially we folks who live here in the American West, where it's just immense. It's not more than 100 miles in any direction. Okay? And in that small place, in one corner here that you see in the northwest corner, disproportionately most of the Basques who ended up coming here to what is Idaho now came from Vizcaya because essentially chain migration. And the way that works is you've got a large city not too far, Bilbao. It's the biggest city in the province of Vizcaya. But for a lot of Basques from the area in and around Guernica, they'd heard about Bilbao, okay? But they never really had been there. And maybe if they had gone, they'd gone enough to kind of be bewildered. They had no real connection with anyone or anything in Bilbao, but they had an uncle in Idaho, or they had the aunt, they had the cousin, or the neighbor's family had gone over. And that was the connection. That's what made it personal. So that's why disproportionately, most all the Basques in the Idaho region, they made this connection with Vizcaya. Conversely, real quick, I'll touch on that more in a moment. Most of the Basques in California instead came from the province of Navarre and the French Basque provinces. And again, for many of the same reasons, chain migration. They already had someone there that they knew, that they had a connection with. But in my case, it was Vizcaya, which is very common here. This is the historical emblem. Well, the updated one. You'll see variations, but this is the latest symbol of the province of Vizcaya, with the tree of Guernica there that you locate. The tree of Guernica, the simplest way to explain it, I think really for Americans, is the Basque equivalent of the Statue of Liberty. So in a sense, the Statue of Liberty, boom, is supposed to symbolize liberty. That's what the tree of Guernica symbolizes for a good many Basques. And it's a good many because what starts in this small town in the province of Vizcaya has become a shared element of Basque identity throughout all 7 historical regions and here in the diaspora. So case in point, I noted that Basques of California are from Navarre, or the provinces in the north, or the French Basque Country. But when we open our festivals in Chino, California, one of the larger Basque communities in Southern California, you bring the clica together. I'll show some images of that, what I'm referencing. But we open with the singing of the American national anthem. And right after that, we pivot, and we all join in what has now become the de facto Basque national anthem, which is the tree of Guernica. So it's a symbol that originates in this small corner of the Basque Country, but now it's become more of a universal symbol for Basques throughout the Basque Country and the diaspora. Now to kind of narrow the focus, make it a little more personal, this is the beginnings of my Basque story. This is my grandfather here on the left. Okay. And my grandfather, Benito, he came to the United States in 1915. And again, because of chain migration, his older sister was already here in Boise. And then he was accompanied over by his brother and 2 other sisters that ended up coming over here. It was here that he met and married another Basque that came over because of chain migration. My grandmother, Asuncion, and they had 2 kids. My dad, Ramon, here in the picture, and my aunt, Ruby. That's the beginnings of our Basque American story. So we were established in 1915. Okay? So my father was a curious hybrid. He was born here in Boise, but he was born in a Basque boarding house. That's what my grandparents ran. First the modern, then later what was called Valencia. So my father, though he was born here in the States, he grew up speaking Basque. His early world was all Basque speaking. And he too had some early challenges when he started going to school, the English schools here in the area. So in that curious way, though my father was born here, he was very much tuned in to a Basque world from his early years. This is a picture now of my mother. Her name is Maria Begoña. She was born in the province of Vizcaya, not too far from Guernica that I referenced earlier, a town named Ibarragelua. So my parents met in 1961, whirlwind romance. My mother agreed to come here to the United States, and in 1962, I was born, and I too grew up in the Basque world. Because my mother, she knew no English initially. She spoke just Spanish and Basque. And back in the 60s, growing up, Blas and others can probably attest to this. You know, our moms would, we were Basque. So I had to wear that Basque sweater. So there's this Basque sweater, and it had all the emblems of the provinces, but instead of having buttons, it had these big balls of yarn with strings, and you would just wrap them like this. You would just wrap those. Pretty embarrassing as a little kid, as I noted earlier, because you don't want to stand out. We were always trying to find ways to fit in, but everybody knew we were Basque, including at St. Joseph's School. Here in the north end of Boise, there were quite a few Basque families. And the teachers politely created a special section in the classroom so that when we brought our lunches from home, we would put them over there. See, because the American kids, they just came with peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. See, but the Basque kids, when we went to school, we always had these fried things. So our lunches smelled all the time. So we always kind of stood out. You were always self-aware that, yes, you are American, but you also knew that you were a little different because of your home context. And it's the same story on my wife's side of the family. This is my wife, Genevieve. Her family story also, I always like to remind her, I'm 119 days older. So we before we actually met much later in our 20s, we were living very much parallel lives. Both of her parents were born and raised in the Basque Country. This is her father, George, born in the province of Nafarroa. And here I mentioned it earlier. He's playing a bugle, and this is characteristic really just of the California Basque American community. We don't have cliques outside of California because this whole music tradition of the clique that you see there in that image, it only emanated from maybe a dozen towns in the French Basque Country. And it's from those towns that a good many of these young men came over here and recreated actually the clique tradition. So you have a clique, as I know, in Chino, California. There's a clique in Bakersfield, California. This is where George, my father-in-law, lived for some years. So he's wearing, because every clique had to kind of have its own look. All right, so their look was they had the green beret and the red ties. And he's playing there for their festival, which is always Memorial Day weekend in May. And then the third and final clique is in San Francisco. There is a hybrid, maybe a wild card fourth. That's in Rockland, California. But many of those folks in Rockland, California actually originated in the Bay Area. So even within our Basque American community, we see manifested different traditions that were essentially transplanted here. This is my mother-in-law, Maite. She too was born in Nafarroa, and she's in the photo there with our two little ones. Well, as parents, we know this, right? My boys now are 22. They don't look like this anymore. See, but our kids are always frozen in time. They'll always be our kids. We always see them like this. So I always tell that to my students at Boise State. Just, if you can, just cut your parents some slack. We can't help it. As we see them, they will always be our children. And our two boys, Kayet and Alex, they grew up being Basque. Not necessarily that maybe they would have chosen this to do all the things that we did, but I think to a large extent they enjoyed it. They participated in Udaleku, which is a once every year Basque cultural summer camp for young kids, ages 10 to 15. They were involved in the Chino dance group when we were living down in Chino. So on both sides of our family, and I think we had one of our guests noted that he too had one parent from the French Basque Country and a parent from the other Southern or Spanish side. And that's the case for our son, Kayet. He's our hybrid. Our son, Alex, we adopted him from the Republic of Kazakhstan. All right, so as far as we know, he's Russian and Kazakh. But we brought him here to America, and it's in America where we made him Basque. So that's our story, and it's going to tie into some of the themes that I wanted to touch on as we explore different ways over time how people have gone about defining what it means to be Basque. Now, it can be a real trick question and response. What does it mean to be Basque? Because we don't have just one answer for this. Whereas historically, until, as I mentioned, just a few generations ago, you pretty much had to be born Basque to have other people consider you to be Basque. It's just one of those, it is what it is. So case in point, if today you decided you wanted to move to India, the subcontinent of India, because you just fell in love with all things Indian, okay, including curry and naan. All right. So you move there, and for the rest of your life, you live there. The majority of people in India would never consider you Indian. So until very recently, this was a worldwide phenomena. You pretty much had to be born into that culture. What we've seen now over the last few generations, though, is a fundamental shift in that. So I touched on how this relates to folks who themselves are not Basque and begin to now come close to the culture to learn more about it. They want to participate. But it also relates to those who were born into Basque families, because now more and more, it's a question of choice. My presentation I distilled from, well, actually several things I've worked on at Basque Studies at Boise State. Until, as I noted very recently, our identity was given. So what I mean by that is who and what you thought you were was largely defined by your family, your friends, and your community. There wasn't really this notion that you might have choices. Now, I'm not saying this in the absolute. There's always been a choice. It's more a question of degree. And I think we can appreciate that now in sharp contrast today. The question I used to illustrate it is a brand new question. What are you going to be when you grow up? They didn't ask that a few hundred years ago because it was presumed. It was a known quantity what you were going to be. So if dad made candles, newsflash, you'll make candles. So we live in a fundamentally different world here, in particular in the Western world. And that's one element that we wanted to kind of spend some time on. How being Basque today has become more so than ever before. It's a choice that people make. Then close behind that comes the question, well, why would someone want to choose Basqueness? So I touched on that when I told that little story, you Basques are cool cats, okay? One of the key elements that we'll explore is the role that's played essentially in marketing or selling being Basque. Because we have so many choices of what we can do, who we can choose to be today. So many different groups we can choose to associate with, whatever Facebook communities we become involved in. If we start doing Harley Davidson stuff, whatever. There's just so many more choices now. So with that, how might we therefore distinguish being Basque? So it's a question of what does it mean to be Basque, and then why even bother? So as I noted, there is no one answer for this. Nowadays, what does it mean to be Basque? It can run the gamut. And these are going to be some of the things that we'll touch on. But there are so many ways of being Basque. Some folks connect with it because they love, say you're a foodie. You just love food. And if you love food, then the odds are you're really going to enjoy Basque cuisine. The Basque cuisine of today. Keep in mind, many of our Basque ancestors, the reason they came here is they were hungry. So they're not eating these gourmet meals that we'll see on shows on TV. That's much more of a recent phenomena. Most of our Basque immigrants were essentially economic refugees. Quick point of contrast, the largest Basque community outside of the Basque country is in Argentina. See, and the majority of the Basques who went there, though, they went as political refugees. So there's that has given the Basque community there in Argentina a different dynamic, because many of their ancestors were in many ways forced to flee because of political reasons in the Basque country. In contrast, in particular here in the American West, most of our early Basque ancestors were economic refugees. essentially, they came to America for this notion of the American promise, the American dream, which is a very peculiar element if you've ever kind of pondered it. Because, well, what other country has the blank dream? I mean, just to conceptualize of this. So here in our Basque American context, we've been less politicized than some of our fellow Basques in the diaspora. And until recently, this always really became apparent whenever we would have opportunities to gather with Basques from throughout the diaspora. So, for example, once every 4 years, the autonomous Basque government of the provinces of Araba, Vizcaya, and Gipuzkoa, they host international congress for delegations throughout the diaspora. There's a few dozen diaspora established institutions that will then send delegations. And that's one of the first things that you'll quickly pick up on. Our Basque friends from Argentina, they inherited far more of a politicized Basque identity. Our Basque identity is far less politicized here because of that historical reason of economic migration. But whether your ancestors now were primarily political or economic refugees, in the diaspora, and I would argue the Iparralde, the French Basque provinces of Lapurdi, Benafarroa, and Chiberua. The diaspora and those three, I'll come to the four in the south here in a moment. But those are very much, I think, in the very same position of this marketplace of cultural identities. So as I noted here in the US, wow, the choices that we have. Yeah, but so does a young person living in Donabani Garasi. They too, though born and raised in what we consider the Basque Country, they too are given a huge assortment of cultural identities to choose from. So what we have in front of us essentially is the Basque word aukera, which literally means choice. And it's the challenge, those of us who have made a connection with our culture and want to see it continue, we have to be very much aware of this ongoing challenge that we have in front of us. How do we now encourage people to want to choose to be Basque? It's a new challenge because historically, as I noted earlier, since identity was primarily given, we have now entered a new age where identity now is more so chosen. So it's created a new dynamic. So let me just provide quickly some historical context for this in what I refer to as generations A, B, and C. Basque fans, Euskera speakers, there is no C in the Basque alphabet, but we're just kind of rolling with it because you'll see it just kind of goes with what we're developing. All right, so with that aside, as I've made references to our Basque ancestors that came here, I consider this generation the automatic Basques. Automatic in the sense that they were born and raised in the Basque Country and their identity was given them. They are Basque. There were very few other real options. Until very recently, in most parts of the world, most folks didn't go more than 20 miles from where they were born. And a lot of our Basque ancestors here, I mean, that was the biggest trip they'd ever taken in their lives to that point. I mean, my mother's father, my maternal grandfather, I remember having a conversation about him. I'm a new Basque speaker. Though my parents were born and raised speaking Basque, I knew phrases, maybe a few sentences, but I was not fluent in Basque. Growing up, I spoke Spanish with my mom, English with my sister and my father, and then my parents spoke Basque. So we had the three languages, but I couldn't really communicate in Basque. So in that sense, I'm a new Basque speaker. I went and learned in the Basque Country. And I was fortunate to have had an opportunity to start learning the language and then be able to converse with my maternal grandfather. And I remember when we were speaking about just the Basque language, and since my Basque was different than what he had, we were talking about it, but my grandfather pointed out, my Basque is great. I can use it 20 miles down the road. Because he traveled enough to know that as soon as you went just a little ways, the dialect would start changing. So in my own family story, there were four of us. There were four, my mother and father and my wife's mother and father, all four native born speaking Basque, but they didn't speak Basque to one another. See, because my family spoke the Biscayan dialect, and then my wife's family spoke the Basha-Nafarwa dialect. So they always spoke to each other in English. So there have been, if you will, challenges until recently. And I don't want to be too pessimistic, because I think there's reasons now for optimism that we can actually maybe keep this going. Our early Basques, against the odds, found ways of keeping Basque identity alive. It's really a marvel, because in a sense, Basques aren't supposed to be here. Odds are, when you have a group that small, as I noted, 100 miles in any direction in the Basque country, groups that small, they're absorbed, they're assimilated by larger groups around them. But Basques, against the odds, have endured into the present. And one of the key ways I think that we can continue to move into the future is to seize upon some new opportunities. A person on our call actually is a great example of this. His given name is Blas Uberuaga, but the world knows him as Boober. See, and what Boober hit upon, and I get this because we both have PhDs, and when you're working on your PhD, everything else looks better. And Blas told me the story that's when he started Boober's Bass page. Because you didn't want, who wants to, have to go into the grind of working on your dissertation? No, this was more fun, is to take advantage of things like the internet and now Zoom, how we can capitalize on these elements. Since the Basques don't have their own nation state, we can now transcend that. We have some great new opportunities in front of us that can help us to adapt to new realities. Our ancestors, though, Generation Automatic, none of this was an issue. They weren't really making a conscious choice to want to go and do Basque things like we do today. I often say, I'm a weekend Basque, so it's very fitting that we're talking here on Saturday. During the week, I think I pretty much blend in, just like the rest of us. Right? We kind of just blend in with our regular lives, whatever it is that we're doing in our career, how we're interacting with our friends, etc. So today, of course, we make that conscious choice to want to participate in a Basque event like, clicking into this Zoom session. But that was not the case for Generation Automatic. There was little or no really choice that was involved. These choices accelerate. And here I'm going with a line from Bernardo Achaga's book, The Accordionist's Son. Bernardo Achaga is one of the most known prolific modern-day Basque authors. So as you can see there, he makes this reference of just how profound of a change that we've gone through over just the last two generations. And he makes, and others have noted this, life was pretty much the same from generation to generation until we hit really kind of like the post-World War II era. And then all bets are off. This was a huge change. And it'll be this change now that will sync with what I referred to as now our next one, Generation B, because it's these folks who are in between two different worlds. Leading Basque American scholar is William Douglas. And then, of course, he recounted to me the interview he had with a Basque immigrant who tells the story. Two brothers are now going to I forget if it was the train depot or it was the ship that the one brother was going to take. But one brother was taking the other because he was now going to go to America. So as the two brothers now say farewell to one another, the brother who is now departing to go to the Americas, he takes off his beret, his boneta, and he gives it to his brother. And the brother is kind of taken aback and he says, "You're going to need this." And the brother who handed it over says, "No, I won't." So here's an example of someone who, even before he gets on the boat, or if it might have been the plane. I forget the exact era that we're discussing. In his mind, he had decided he was going to flip the switch. He was done. He was done with things Basque. So it's with this Generation B that we begin to introduce, circa 1950s, 1960s, Basque migration here in the United States by the 1970s will pretty much come to a halt. That's when the sheep industry is also undergoing a transformation. Economically, things are improving in the Basque homeland, so there isn't this same push for economic refugees. But it's in this closer generation, and this would be like my mother that I had introduced coming here in the 60s. So she too is born and raised, she knows the Basque world, but now she's dropped in the middle of Boise, Idaho. So now this generation, well, can make these kinds of choices of how much or how little they would choose to stay involved with all things Basque. Until finally, we get to the third generation. And of course, in this generational model, there's a lot of overlap. It doesn't fit nice and neat into specific years. But generally, as we get now to this third generation, we're referred to as the generation choosers. These are now the children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and great-great-great-grandchildren. They have little or no connection with Basque country. They're cognizant that they're Basque because their family has told them this. But it's this generation that will determine the future of how long and in what way Basque identity will endure. So contextually, we have these three generations. Our Generation A, they're no longer with us. Okay, some of us are still fortunate. I'm lucky to count that I have my mother still. My father passed away some years ago. And my mother's one of the living elements of Generation B, the betweeners. But these folks now are in their 70s, 80s, some in their 90s. So we're very much now in our diaspora, our Basque American community, the generation of choosers. So then, of course, that opens up the question, well, choose what? What does it mean to be Basque? How exactly is this defined? In an effort to assist with this, in the 1970s, a group of Basques took on, which if you're aware of the Basque history, if you have two Basques, you'll have three opinions. I mean, it's almost, and where you have one Basque club, you'll have two Basque clubs. I mean, this just seems to come with territory. My late colleague, Dave Laciando, at Basque Studies here at Boise State, I think said it best when he pointed out, if it ain't hard, make it hard, the Basque way. So against the odds in the 1970s, a group of folks explored the possibility, can we create some sort of federation? See, previously, the Basques of Argentina had succeeded in creating this. In their case, their acronym is FEBA. That's the Federation for Basque Entities in Argentina. So they had succeeded in building a coalition. So that model that originated in Argentina, it was actually Bill Douglas and Jon Bilbao when they were doing their research for the book that they had published, Americanuak, which is, I highly recommend that if you wanted a deeper dive in the story of the Basque diaspora here in the Americas. So they came in contact with the Argentinian Basques, and they came back with this idea of FEBA. Some folks took an interest to it here, and lo and behold, it worked. Not that if you were a betting man that you would have betted in the 1970s that this would have taken. But today, the North American Basque organizations counts over 40 entities in the United States, Canada, and now France, because we just had a new introduction, the Basque Club of Miquelon, and because of where it's situated, it is still under French authority. So what started just as a handful of clubs in the 1970s has now grown to, as I noted, over 40. And it's entities like the North American Basque organizations and your own local clubs that are trying to, well, keep this saying alive. In Basque, it's Isan Sida Lako Gara. Eta garalako izango dira. Translated, because they were, we are. And because we are, they will be. That's our charge. That's our appointed task. That's our mission impossible, if you're willing to accept the mission. Against the odds, Basques are still around. So the challenge is now that of our generation and the generations alive today. How might we be able to make being Basque a viable option going into the future? So with that, I think it's important that we have an opportunity to kind of take a look back and where we have a historical context for this. Norguinen in the Basque language means who were we? Here's a early photo, first part of the 20th century. This is a group of Basques, and you'll note none of them are wearing berets, because they're going local. They're trying to be native. And they also have the very distinctive, if you kind of see here, these are the original 501s. And the way that you showed that they were brand new pants is you rolled them up here on the bottom. And that's how everybody knew. See how you wanted to put it in the front here? Everybody now knew you had a new pair of 501 Levi's. So with that as our context, and it's a personal story for me, this was my great aunt. Up above her, you can see the painted sign on the side of the building. That was my grandfather, who was the proprietor of the Modern Hotel, a Basque boarding house. So my grandfather, who came here in the 1915, he too was born and raised in the Basque country, but he's of the Generation B. So he went back and forth. He stayed Basque till the day he died, speaking Basque. Good many of his friends were Basque. But he made it a point also to be American. He became an American citizen as early as he could. And as the proprietor of our family boarding house, he made it a point to take the Basque herders who were living there to baseball games. So he told them, you're living in America now, so you got to start doing American things. So in that case, we see this curious hybrid that begins to emerge. So you took elements of the traditional Basque world that was transplanted, what I refer to as defining values that you see here. And we're going to take a closer look at each of these because they all represent ways of got Basque or being Basque. There is no one primary or determinant or variable. Then and now, it's a combination of things. So we're going to take a look at our immigrant generations because we have some historical context for that. And then we're going to finish with potentially how today we might be looking at ways of remaining Basque. So I refer to this generation as Belaunaldi Gu. Gu means us. See, and this is one of the big shifts we've had in our society over the last few generations. Historically, traditionally, we had generations. The focus was not on the individual. I mean, even surnames, last names are very recent, right? So Christ is not his last name. It was not common for folks to have surnames until very recently, and that reflected essentially how society was organized. It was organized around the importance of the community. Okay? The individual was secondary. The individual was expected to conform to society. Now, I think many of us, I don't need to go into the specifics, I think you've seen how for some folks, this whole dynamic has been flipped upside down. Now society must accept my definition. All right, so it's in the context, therefore, of this transition that will start from the historical vantage point and bring it into the recent present. So in no particular order, some elements of how historically Basques identified themselves, a key determinant was the language. We called them Basques, B-A-S-Q-U-E. We inherited that from the French translation. In Spanish, it's Vasco. And we got Vasco from Vascunum. This was one of the many names that Roman historians gave to the groups of people they found in that part of the world when the Romans got there. So about over 2,000 years ago, as Rome expanded its domain, they came into contact with Basques. They had no idea what they were talking. It was a completely foreign language. Okay? And we're not even exactly sure how they came up with these names, one of which was Vascunum. And then from Vascunum, we got Vasco, and then the French variation on that was Basque. That's all well and good, but that's not what Basques called themselves 2,000 years ago. They called themselves Euskaldunak, which, as you can read there, literally means those who speak the Basque language. Today, we don't need to go give examples of this. I think we're all very cognizant of the fact of the key role that race plays. For better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, race is a constant motif, theme that always comes up. But it's very recent. Race becomes a dominant element about 500 years ago. Before that, before race became such a dominant element, now I'm speaking primarily about the Western world, because it had to do with the African slave trade. Slavery now became color-coded. Only blacks were slaves. See, but 2,000 years ago, I touched on the Romans. The Romans, we believe that in the ancient city of Rome, every family that could afford it had a slave. I mean, so slavery was omnipresent. And what's telling is the Romans didn't care what your race was. They didn't color code when it came to slavery. So race is a very recent element in distinguishing one group from another. Before race became that dominant in the Western world, the dominant element that distinguished one group from another was language. And that was the case with Basques. And it's one of the reasons that Basques are still here. The language is unique. It is not related to any other language in the world today, despite the best efforts of people who are desperate to finish a Ph.D. in linguistics, who will come up with new and exciting theories. Because for trying to see if you can find a connection with the Basque language to another language, it's like the Holy Grail. All right, so we've had a lot of folks, those of us who were involved in, studying and exploring the Basque world. We know there's folks who are vigorously looking for this connection, but there's no substantive case. It's an isolate. It's a language unique unto itself, and it's one of the key elements that maintained a sense of Basque identity, and that continues into the present. So let me touch on that where I left off last time. The Egoalde, the southern or Spanish side of the Basque Country. See, the French Basque Country is having a crisis in terms of the language there. My mother-in-law and father-in-law are each one of 11 kids. All right, so all 11 of those kids of that generation spoke Basque. All right, so then we track using them as an example of the Iparralde. Okay, then all those 11, a good many of them got married. By the time we get to our generation, the first cousins, in the Iparralde, most of them do not speak Basque anymore. It's disappearing rapidly. Conversely, in the Egoalde, on the southern side or the Spanish side of the Basque Country, there's been a rebirth of the Basque language to one of the youngest, oldest languages in the world. The majority of people who now speak the Basque language are under age 30 because of the resurgence of now folks learning this language. So in the Egoalde, the southern part of the Basque Country, one of the key elements of trying to maintain a sense of Basque identity has been to reclaim the linguistic heritage. As I noted, though, with the diaspora as well as the French Basque provinces, that's a bigger challenge for many of us here in the United States using our context of maintaining the Basque language. But the effort continues, and a good many Basque clubs are making an effort to offer classes in the Basque language. Okay? But historically, one of the key elements that defined Basque identity was the language, Euskara. Second, a key element that distinguished and effectively kind of established many of our traditions into the present of our Basque community here in the American West as I noted, our ancestors were economic refugees, and almost all of them came from a rural context. Okay? So it's one of the contrasts that Basques refer to as the Baserritarra and the Kaletarra, as you can read there. And in fact, we have it kind of skewed here. See, okay, city slicker. All right, city slicker, though, doesn't generally have that negative connotation, right? See, but if you go to the other side of the coin, then you get redneck. All right, that's got more of a sting. So we all know, I mean, historically, how this tension between those who lived in the city versus those in the country. So our context, we had very few folks that immigrated from urban areas. Disproportionately, it's those folks who went to Latin America, the Kaletarrak. Our ancestors came more from a rural environment, the world of the Baserri, or the traditional Basque farmhouse. So it's that rural perspective that was transplanted here. Third key element of transplanted and what identified Basque identity, and this of course is not unique to being Basque, most all traditional societies place a heavy emphasis on the family. And that was one of the key elements that Basques successfully transplanted here. And that family connection is celebrated every Basque festival. Because you'll have 2, 3, maybe even 4 generations all together. And this is a plus. If you're aware with our American friends, it's one of the things that quickly strikes them, right? When they come to Basque events, wow, you have all different ages here. See, because in America, we age segregate. It started early on with first grade, right? You know, age 6, boom, we're put with this group, this cohort, okay? And that pretty much endures till, you know, after high school. Then after high school, it starts blending together. But all of us can remember junior high, high school, there was a big difference between being a sophomore, a junior, or a senior. Okay? So in emphasizing family, what Basques were able to tap into is this multi-generational connection. And overall, it's a great plus because it keeps us all honest. All right, so the young people, all right, there they are at the party, but then they look over, you know, and there's the parents and there's the grandparents. So I guess you kind of have to keep a lid on this. But then it works in the other direction. Okay, as a parent, I guess, well, we can't let loose that much. We got the kids here. This multi-generational element is one of the key drawing attractive elements of many of our festivals, because there's very little in our American lives where we see that kind of blending. So the importance of the family then and now is one of the distinguishing elements of Got Basque. Now, from the immediate family, it expands to a general sense of community. And this meeting never happened. Okay? So the meeting that never happened was these Basques who decided they were going to migrate, and whether they were going to go to Australia or Uruguay, Mexico, Canada, you name it. The meeting that never happened was this. All right, as you're preparing, we handed out a checklist of things to take, you know, so don't forget your toothbrush and all this stuff. All right, but now, and again, this never happened. The meeting pivots. All right, so when you get to your destination, one of the first things you want to do is you get together with other Basque people and you start creating festivals. You start creating Basque clubs. You start dancing groups for your young kids, et cetera, et cetera. This meeting never happened. Nevertheless, wherever Basque people went in the world, they transplanted this sense of a larger Basque community. From Argentina to Mexico to Australia, it's almost the same pattern or model that was transplanted. So a key element, therefore, of Basque identity historically was this emphasis on a sense of community. And that's what endures into the present. I noted earlier about Hayaldi. Over half of the volunteers were not Basque themselves. All right, but of the hundreds who threw in, that was for a shared sense of community. So you had the importance of the family, but then beyond the family, the importance of community. And now this is what we benefited from. Our early, from the Generation A automatic into Generation B, the betweeners. Early on, here in the United States, a good many Basque immigrants were not looked upon favorably. Most of them were disproportionately young men, and many of them came like other young men from Italy, other young men from Ireland, etc. They came here to make money to go back home. And this is what already Americans who were here picked up on. All right, so, okay, hold on. Let me see if I get this right. You want to come here, grab everything you can, and then you're going to go back home. Versus, do you want to throw in and maybe give us something back? And this is what now addressed that issue, where there might have been pushback. And in the case, my father grew up with this whole notion of black Bascos. And I asked him, where did the black Basco thing come from? And he wasn't really sure either. Was it because Basques, because they were out herding sheep, that they were exposed to the sun more, so they had this rural agrarian, so their skin was darker? All right, but Basques were initially, if you will, this outside group that always kind of kept to themselves. They're having their private parties in the Basque boarding houses, their own private festivals out in the mountains. Over time, our Basque ancestors were able to befriend our non-Basque neighbors. And one of the big things that our non-Basque neighbors picked up on was the Basque work ethic. That's why disproportionately, for example, so many Basques now became connected with the sheep business, which is the one word answer why there are so many Basques here in the American West. It was one of the few ways that Basques come over here legally. It was also the means that was established by what I touched on earlier, chain migration. Our ancestors had to work hard. As I noted, they were economic refugees. And because of the sacrifices of that generation, we, the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, we've been afforded some great opportunities. Though many of these early Basque immigrants came with the idea of returning to the Basque homeland, and some of them did. But many now, after being here for a while, decided that they would make the United States their new home. And they worked hard to not only improve their lives, but also what our non-Basque neighbors found, they worked hard to improve the local community as well. Case in point, the Elko Basque Picnic is the 4th of July weekend. Yeah. And it was chosen on purpose, and not to create a private separate party. They wanted to throw in and say, we want to be American. We want to celebrate America. So still today, it's the Elko Basque Club that sponsors and hosts their annual 4th of July parade. That if you're rolling, Elko has announced they're on. They're going to have a festival. So their Basque clubs are determining if and when they'll be able to open. Elko has made the call. They're going to go ahead with the 4th of July weekend. But that's an example, therefore, of us benefiting from the sacrifices of that earlier generation. Because as you can see here in the image, that was a tough life. And sheep are stupid. They're some of the dumbest animals around. Okay, so nobody really chooses to want to be a Basque sheep herder. It was because primarily of economic necessity. And our ancestors worked hard, allowing us, therefore, some new opportunities here in America. Just a few more elements that were transplanted. Most of our Basque festivals actually have included in it a religious element. Most all Basques historically were raised Catholic, Roman Catholic. And that was transplanted here to our Basque American communities. In this image of some years ago, we had the Basque chaplain, Aita, Father Marcel Tius. He was born and raised in the Basque country, Chiberua, province of Chiberua. And he was the last chaplain that was sent here by the Bishop of Bayonne. The Bayonne diocese is of the Iparralde. This picture, Father Marcel is celebrating Catholic Mass, and there you can see the Clica participating in this. So many of our Basque festivals have folded into it this Catholic dimension. And like all things that are festival, you pick what you want. So if you identify as being Catholic, as being religious, you would go a little bit earlier and you would go to the Mass. But if you're not Catholic, or if you had too big of a party the night before, then you show up for the big barbecue at lunch. All right, and then maybe then you pivot and you start playing cards, because being Basque for you is playing the Basque card game Moose. Or maybe instead of playing Moose, you're going to go over because you want to go see the little kids perform. So there are many ways of being Basque historically, and that continues into the present. In Basque, the word is itza, emanda, which means effectively our one word for it is honor, but it's to give your word. Now, nowadays, we're used to having to have lawyers do all this stuff. We got to have a notary public sign off on this, et cetera, et cetera. But again, this is a credit to our ancestors, the importance of honor. And when a Basque said he was going to do something, you could count on him or her that he or she would do it. And again, this is what we were given as our inheritance by the Basque immigrant generation. Their work ethic and this reputation that Basques are people of their word. And last but not least, you finish what you start. You don't quit. Example of this is traditional Basque sport. And if you've had an opportunity to go to some festivals that feature this, it's pretty tough because it's very expensive to do this. And number two, it's a very specialized element. So not all Basque clubs, Basque festivals can maintain this on a consistent basis. But traditional Basque sports include things like traditional Basque weightlifting, wood chopping. So using wood chopping as an example, in the competition, say there you have two wood choppers, and they have to cut through, say, 6 logs. And each log it's a whopper. You know, it's a 12, 60-inch diameter. All right, so they start at the same time, go, and they start chopping. All right, over time, one person opens up a lead, and as you're watching, it becomes very clear who chops through the logs first, and he's the winner. What's very telling, if you've been to the wood, if you've seen this, we already know who won. All right, so there's first place, there's second place. So why does he keep chopping? Why does the second place guy keep chopping? Because historically, embedded in the cultural DNA is you finish what you start. Basques have defied the odds to endure as an identifiable community today. And that's the charge that's been passed now to Basques of this generation. Our ancestors, against the odds, found ways to keep Basque identity alive. So that's our challenge of today, to persevere and to find in what ways we can now successfully transmit being Basque to future generations. There's no one way to be Basque. If you want to chop logs, go for it. If you want to carry chingat or weights, 105 pounds in each hand, and who can go the furthest, go for that. So it can be via athletics, handball, etc. If you love food, you could throw in, for example, the Utah Basque Club has a cook club, a subset of their club where folks get together. It can be music, song. In Boise now, we have Basque here who has started a Bersolariza school via Zoom. So he's teaching folks who are interested in the Basque art of improvising verse. So there's no one way to be Basque. So we just say, pick one. Learn the language, learn to dance, learn to play moose. But if you can find at least something that you find of interest, that can be the means of preserving a sense of Basque identity into the future. And that's it, with 2 minutes to spare.